Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today I want to talk about pricing. It's a topic I used to do a little bit more videos on, but I have a viewpoint today because I've been talking to people in the hobby. I've been talking to card shop owners, collectors, and I feel like we have something to discuss here. Hobbies always had ups and downs. It's never all one direction or not. Even when you look at indexes across the board, and I've created my own index. I did it for this video in 2022. I call it the Cards and Comics Index. It's like a 20 card index. And so I've just been using this index. I'm going to use it again to showcase kind of movement of pricing in the hobby. But what I want to point out is that it's never all negative and never all positive. In the dark days of the hobby, and that, in my opinion, around 2007, 2008, there were still cards and sets and things that were popular, vintage and modern. It always happens. In fact, this year at the National, I saw a great amount of interest in 1914 Cracker Jacks, right? A set, obviously it's very mature. Why is there a bunch of interest in it? Well, because some people are thinking that it's really rare compared to 15s, and they really think that they should be valued higher. So there's a buying group out there making some investments in those cards. Thing I want to point out, and that's what this video back in 2022 was about. Was that looking at a 5-year CAGR? The hobby has always had some growth built into it if you look at it in the long-term view. So even though prices are going down now, there is going to be stabilization. There's going to be flattening. There is going to be a point where they're going to see prices going up. Start with 1 or 2 cards, that you collect. Then it'll be 5 or 10 cards. And then, we'll get back to a more reasonable growth for the hobby versus the massive growth and massive losses we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years. And I'm showing here is, picking up from that 22 video, I'm adding 23 and 24 data. And I'm showing the fact that, yes, the losses are still happening, but they're, again, going in a much slower rate in 24 versus 23. And there's cards that you've either kind of flattened to where they're just, basically no movement. I would say a 2% loss on a card is pretty much non-movement. And then there's cards that have gained value, along with cards that are kind of, you know, reducing in value at quite a bit at a pretty good rate. I look at a card like the 52 Topps Jackie Robinson, and everyone would be like, "Why would that card be losing value?" And it's just because it went up in value too much. It was one of those cards that people really, I don't say speculated on, but really went out and tried to get. And I saw a lot of people that had no vintage cards buying cards like 52 Jackie Robinsons, 48 Leaf Robinsons, and thinking like, I need to have a couple vintage cards in my collection, and Jackie would be the best player. And I kind of agree with that. But if it's not core, and what we're seeing is people are now selling those cards. We're seeing people like getting rid of those cards, and there's not as much demand because that was the artificial demand that drove the price up. Was collectors who never collected vintage getting into vintage, and they were targeting Jackie Robinson. There's a lot of hype around in that 2020 time period for Jackie and the Negro League players. So again, I just feel like it's a natural progression for that card to get a lot of hype. That is a great card. I have no doubt in my mind that that card is going to continue to go up in value over a long period of time. And that's really what you got to get into here is your mindset is if you're going to collect vintage or some of these blue chip cards, you can't think about 1 year over year, 1 year to year value. It's that 5 or 10 year value. And these are long-term hold type cards. So you're going to buy them. You need to hold them 5 or 10 years, 10 years probably, to really see a guaranteed return if you really want to hold and sell. These are not flipping cards. So these are cards that are for long-term collectors to hold and then sell. And then in general, they're going to make some money usually. So when we look at it just in terms of visual representation, I love waterfall charts. Uh, I know this doesn't add up to the, to 100, which what the waterfall does, but I just want to show you visual representation of how each card is going up and down. And that is, I wish I could have got it on a flat scale. I was just playing around with some charts in Excel, but I thought this was a good representation of just the ups and downs of every player, every card, and just to show you, like, look, it's a mixed bag. There's cards gaining value, cards that are very flat, cards losing a lot of value, and cards that I would have thought, like the 89 Griffey, it lost 15% of value as a PSA 10, and I would have been like, or PSA 9, and I would think that's still way overpriced compared to the value or the pop count. But again, it's all about demand. And that's the one thing I'll talk about in a second too is demand, because that's the other part of your supply or your pricing equation is demand, right? And so, if you take everything and, and average it out, in the index year over year, the losses between 22 and 23 year over year, we're looking at 12% versus 4%, 23 versus 24, which is, a slowdown of tremendous amount. It's three times lower than it was in 22 versus 23. It's 23, 24 versus 23. So it's a very good story in case people wanted to come into the market today. I do think we talk about hitting the floor. I do think we're starting to see that leveling out in that floor. That these cards have started to really kind of hit their natural bottom. That a lot of them are going to not sink too much further. But again, we have to understand, like, if you look at 100 cards, 200 cards, 300 cards in an index or just across the board, there's going to be pluses and minuses. And again, let's all go back to the mantra on vintage cards is that the condition of the card and the grade that you're looking at can vary. That there is an eye appeal is part of the equation. So again, there's multiple factors here that you can't just average everything out and say, well, this is what it's always going to do, right? Because you could look at one card that I say is okay, it's 20% loss on average, but there's one or two cards that in that same grade that brought more than the average selling price, because they had great tremendous eye appeal, and that can happen. So vintage cards are something that you have to really make sure that you're looking at condition, looking at centering if you really want to maximize return. And that's sort of a different video on how to buy, how to ensure yourself that if you want the maximum amount for that card, even if it's going up, if that card's going down in value in general, but you still don't want to have massive, the lowest price ever, having great eye appeal and condition can prevent you from losing more money in a card. And I think that's what sometimes these new collectors get into the market don't realize with vintage cards, especially if you're going to hold only 4 or 5, you better buy the best condition and eye appeal cards you can, and that's going to protect you in general in terms of value, and in terms of losses as well. Now, I talked about demand, and I think the thing I want to talk about today as well is the hobby itself. There's a little bit of a gnashing of teeth right now in the hobby, and the fear I see talking to people is the demand. The demand is going down. I'm hearing repackers aren't, being as aggressive. They're not showing up to every show like they used to. They're not walking around giving everybody, hundies, for every card. So that's going to affect, how much people get on the percentage, for selling. It's going to make things a little bit harder for people to kind of flip cards as well if the demand is going down. And I think that is a two-part story. One is it's the end of the year. There's always a slowdown during the holidays. I think it's a very common thing to see people starting to say, look, I got to buy Christmas. I got to do this. I got travel coming up. I've got this and that for the holidays. I can't just keep afford, maybe my card budget has to go down. I think that's definitely true. I get most of my best deals around Christmas time when I'm looking at buying vintage or other cards. Christmas and New Year's, January still isn't like everyone talks about January being a big rebound. I think it's most likely February. I see even in January, I get some good deals. So again, I think, right now is a wall, and it's a little bit of a natural wall. But I do think overall the demand is going to go down. I think the idea of like, these 8,000, 10,000, 20,000 boxes of cards being absorbed into the hobby, that's going to, take away some enthusiasm to buy singles. Or if you're buying singles, you're paying a lot for some of these cards. You're gonna have to absorb a lot of one-of-ones for a lot of players like Wimbiana, or Wimby or whatever. It's just it's a lot. The manufacturers are overproducing. That's a given fact. They're producing too much cards. That's being absorbed in the hobby. That's going to stretch the dollar thinner and thinner. And so a lot of people like myself, which have moved away from modern cards for that reason, and also buying 90s and pre-war cards, we still have, there's only so much dollar to go around. even in those markets. And in those markets, and again, in the 90s cards, there are still some cards bringing crazy dollars. Um, it's going to affect, if you're buying those cards, you're not buying, some other cards. So it's like you view it like a piece of pie. There's only so much to go around. And I do feel like we're seeing a stretching of the dollar. We're seeing some fatigue. Holidays are happening. So all that's going to buy into or go into this whole equation. And we just had, big card shows, Comic Cons. It's just a lot. And so I don't want people to, start to think about panicking. Like this is like, a crash. Like everything's going to go down to zero or something silly like that. It's never going to happen for one reason, for one thing. And secondly is, we're seeing some cards, gain value. On the modern card, players that are playing well, their cards are worth more. In the vintage area, there's certain sets and certain cards, certain players that are still hot and still selling well. So it's not it's not all one thing. It's not all one direction. So, as you're thinking about purchasing cards for the remainder of the year or into next year, I think right now it's a good time to think about if you have a PC card that you're really looking for. You might be able to get the best deal right now. I think it's flattening, right? Prices are flattening. So I don't know much how, if you're going to wait, like I think people have talked about waiting. I'm waiting and waiting and waiting to buy a card. I'm waiting for the bottom. I think, we're starting to see it. This, 23 versus 24, this 4% versus 12%, we're seeing it. Now, if you want to wait another year, I'm not going to argue with you. I could say, it could next year could go down another 2 or 3%, or even 5%. I still would think that's pretty normal. And you're going to say, well, I waited another year and I got the card for another 5 or 6% lower than what I could have gotten 24. Great. But I'm just saying right now might be a good time, especially if it's a popular hot card, to think about, this could be a good time to make a purchase if you've got the money and you are in that position. Because I just don't know how much more lower it's going to get for the blue chip stuff, for stuff that people still want to buy and collect, regardless of what happens in the modern world. There are cards like Cobb's and Honus Wagner's and Babe Ruth cards and things like that that are always going to be in that blue chip realm. And so if you've been waiting to pull the trigger, I think now is the time to start really looking. Maybe go look at some auction houses, do some scouting, make some plans, and you might have a fun Christmas. Get unwrap a present you gave to yourself, right? Which is always kind of fun. But yeah, this is my take on the current situation. I'm not trying to be overly optimistic because I'm still showing negative numbers for the most part. I'm just trying to say, don't fall into the trap of just everything is doom and gloom, nothing is going up, everything is sucks kind of mentality. It's not that way. Again, it's more normal like it was in 2018 and 2019 when it's specific players, specific cards, specific sets. Condition matters a whole bunch. So that equation still sticks today. That's the equation that hobby normally runs on. Not this over exuberance and every card and every set is worth, 10 times what it was 2 years ago just because they exist. Because there was no rhyme or reason to some of these cards going up in value back in 2020 to 2022. So that's where we're at today, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think about pricing, what you're seeing out there. I'm interested in hearing your comments, your thoughts. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.